Effective cross-cultural living is about knowing the rules of the society or the culture so that you can figure out how to adapt and live well in that society. And what I want to do in this lecture is take a look at 7 key cultural rules that, in my opinion, are really important for getting a grasp on Chinese society and trying to figure out how to navigate through Chinese culture. And I've identified, like I said, I've identified 7, and these, of course, there are more, but in my opinion, these 7 key cultural rules are the rules at which, for most of us who come from Western countries, these are the points at which our cultures will tend to clash the most and will have the most culture shock or will experience the most culture stress. The first one I want to talk about is the concept of Guanxi. Now, Guanxi is a Chinese word that literally means relationship. If you look it up in the dictionary, it's just going to say it means relationship. And at the heart of Chinese culture is this concept of relationship, and it comes from Confucianism. Now, there are 2 ways of thinking about relationship. One is denotative and one is connotative. The denotative meaning of the word Guanxi is simply relationship. If I know you, you know me, we can say that we have Guanxi. But there's also a connotative meaning that is more like connections or backdoor, and it's the art or it's the practice of using the relationship to accomplish something. We in the West might call it networking. We might call it, he's got connections of some kind. Cultivating and maintaining relationships is the most important thing that you can do in living and working in China and living and working successfully. It's building networks of relationships, not just so that you can accomplish something, but so that you can genuinely make friends. Now, the tricky part for Westerners is that part of being in a relationship is, in fact, using the relationship to accomplish something. And for Westerners, that's bad. We label that manipulation. For Chinese, that's just part of what a relationship is. Friends help friends. The second key cultural rule is interpersonal harmony. The way in which you cultivate and maintain these relationships is through maintaining personal harmony. Confucius taught that in order for society to be stable and harmonious, people had to maintain stability and harmony in their everyday interpersonal relationships. So maintaining harmony among the group, not causing offense, is very, very important in Chinese society. And as you relate to Chinese people, you have to be very careful not to say things that will be offensive. Always take into consideration the personal feelings of the people that you're dealing with. The third cultural rule is social hierarchy. Now, in some ways, this is counterintuitive because Chinese is supposedly a socialist society, and especially under Chairman Mao, there was a lot of talk about building a classless society. He wanted to do away with all of the social structures and the ranking. But at its heart, Chinese culture today still remains deeply hierarchical. Status matters. Who you are, the pecking order still matters. It's one of the reasons why when you meet a Chinese person, they give you a business card, because the business card is a way to show another person what your status is. You'll often see, I'm a college president, I'm head of this, I'm head of that, I'm head of this. All of that is a way to show what the status is of the person. Status in China can be determined by your rank. If you're a government official, what rank of a government official are you? What is your position in your company? What is your position in your organization or your institution? It can be determined by age. Chinese people have a lot of respect for elderly people, and they treat them very well. I remember one time my aunt came and visited me in China, and even though she was only in her 50s, she had gray hair. And everywhere we went, Chinese people would see her and they would grab her and throw her into a chair, and they would say, "Oh, you must be very tired. Please sit down." And after a few times of this, she came to me and she said, "Joann, why are they doing this?" And I said, "Well, they think you're older, and this is their way of showing respect." And once she understood that, she moved from being annoyed to being flattered. And she says, "Well, I kind of like China and the way they treat older people with respect." Your level of education can also give you your status. And so the social hierarchy is very important. And this plays out in everyday life as you interact with people. We often say that, when you get to the door and you're with another person, the person of the highest rank should go through the door first. And so there's a lot of jostling and jockeying at the door to show honor to to another person and let them go through the door. Now the question is, what about a foreigner? You're going to China, you're going to be a foreigner. Where does the foreigner fit in the rank in this social hierarchy? Well, ironically, because you're a foreigner, you're placed very high in the rank because you're a guest. Chinese look at foreigners in their countries as guests. So you may be given a lot of honorific treatment. You'll be given the banquets. You'll be given the nicest seat in the church or things like this. It's because you're a foreigner. But also there can be different ranks of foreigner. If you're going to China and you're going to be a foreign teacher, you're going to have a higher status because you're a teacher. Now maybe within the university system you'll have a lower rank because you're 25 years old or you're younger. So where you fit, foreigners kind of gum the system up, let me say that, because you're high because you're a foreigner, but if you're a foreign student, for example, you're pretty low on the totem pole because you're a student, and students in Chinese society are not considered to really have any ranking at all. So it's good to know when you get to China to figure out where you fit in the social hierarchy system. The fourth key cultural rule that I want to talk about is obligation and reciprocity. The Chinese have a phrase for this, and it's called li shang wang lai, which literally means a favor given must be returned. And doing favors, helping one another, all of this is how you maintain that interpersonal harmony and relationships that I mentioned earlier. And this is an area that Westerners get tripped up in a lot, is because Chinese people engage in relationships by doing favors and asking favors of people. And a favor given must be returned. And we sometimes have a hard time because we go to China and we meet Chinese friends and maybe our students or maybe our coworkers, and they're very helpful and they do things for us. But then along will come a request. Will you help me? And will you do something for me? And we need to know that when we engage in interpersonal relationships with Chinese people, we are going to be drawn into this system of helping one another out and helping each other out. And it can be quite difficult. The other thing that's difficult with this is that obligation is a good thing in Chinese society. Now, in Western culture, particularly in the United States where I'm from, doing something out of obligation tends to be a negative. And let me give you an example of this. My first year in China, I was doing something really stupid. I was playing with a bungee cord. Now, don't ever play with a bungee cord. I was playing with it, and I put it under my foot, and it released and went up, and it caught my eye. And there was blood everywhere, and I thought that I had lost my eye. Fortunately, I didn't, but the doctor came and told me to rest for a few days. And so my students came to visit me, and this was back in the 1980s, and a foreigner was a big deal back then, and also China didn't have any flowers in the 1980s, and so my students brought me these, all 15 of them showed up in my room, and they brought me this little bouquet of plastic flowers, and I was deeply touched. And I thanked the students, and I said, you know, it means a lot to me that you came, and I expressed my gratitude. And in unison, they replied in English, "Don't thank us, this is our duty." And if you're like me, the first thought when you hear somebody say that is, well, you didn't want to do it, you just did it because it was your duty. For us, for Westerners, if we do something out of duty, it implies that there's no sincerity, but that's not the case in China. To do something out of duty is the highest motivation that you can do something. And this is why in China, a lot of times when you thank people, they'll say, "It's my duty." So doing something out of duty or debt is actually a positive thing. And this can be a real source of culture clash when foreigners are working in China. The fifth cultural rule that I want to talk about is the concept of face. And this is probably the most difficult one to talk about because it's hard to talk about it. It's the air that Chinese people breathe. It's the way they process the world, but they themselves don't like to talk about it. Face really is your social dignity or your social credit, how you are perceived among members of your group. And maintaining your face or maintaining your dignity in front of the group is extremely important in China. In fact, I used to have a professor who told me that in Chinese culture, saving face is more important than saving your life. Now, as foreigners, when we go to China, it's important to know this because there are things that we can do that will give face to our Chinese friends and colleagues, and things that we can do that will cause them to lose face. And I think if we're going to China and we want to serve effectively, obviously, that's not something that we want to do. One of the things that we do to save face or to not cause somebody to lose face is avoiding criticism in a public setting. If you're in a workplace, for example, you don't criticize your coworker, or you don't criticize somebody who works under you in a public setting. Chinese people will tend not to offer their opinions. They'll tend not to give direct feedback. And all of that is because they don't want to lose face. They don't want to lose their face. They don't want to lose, they don't want the person they're talking to lose face as well. Another area where we see face play out is the aversion to saying no directly. There is this belief that if I say no directly, that everybody will lose face. And so, so you'll get this in China. Oh, can I do something? And you'll get, oh, well, perhaps you can do that, or maybe you can do that. The answer is probably no, but they don't want to do that because they don't want to cause you to lose face. So as you build relationships with Chinese people, it's very important to remember that they have this concept of face, and to be very diligent in trying not to cause them to lose face in front of their group, and that many of the ways in which they communicate with you will be done so that they don't cause you to lose face. And that brings me to the sixth key cultural rule that I want to talk about, which is indirect communication. Many Westerners go to China and they get very frustrated because they find it very difficult to get a straight answer. Whether it's asking for water, whether, can I do this? The answer, we often joke that in China, the most common answer is perhaps. Now, the problem, of course, is perhaps sometimes means yes, and it sometimes means no, but sometimes it means actually perhaps. But part of the reason for the Chinese indirect communication style is rooted in this desire to save face. And this really goes against Western notions, particularly American cultural value, where we have a phrase that says, say what you mean and mean what you say. Don't beat around the bush. But if you're concerned about face and preserving interpersonal harmony, you're going to want to beat around the bush. You're going to want to be indirect in your communication. And one of the ways in which we see this indirect communication a lot is in the home. If you have Chinese friends and you invite them into your home and you offer them, for example, you say to your friend, Xiao Wang, would you like some water? They're going to say no. They have been taught that the polite thing is to say no. They could be dying of thirst, ready to drop dead, but they're going to say no. That's indirect communication. Now, what you have to do as the guest is to continue to offer it and give it to them, whether or not they want it. But this is just probably the most concrete example of this indirect communication. I do want to give this caution that it's not necessarily true that all Chinese speech is indirect and all Western speech is indirect. In many cases, they flip them on their heads, and where Chinese are indirect, Westerners are direct, and where Chinese are direct, Westerners are indirect. So don't be shocked if a Chinese person comes up to you out of the blue randomly, maybe a taxi driver, and asks you the question, how much money do you make? Now that's a question that would never be considered appropriate in Western culture, particularly in the United States, but it's perfectly normal. So it's an area where they can be direct, where we're indirect. So we see a lot of the clashing of cultures in this area because a lot of times we're talking past one another. The seventh key cultural rule that I think is very important to get a handle on is the concept of insiders and outsiders are different. And this really cuts against Western notions of egalitarian and treat everybody equal. And again, the Chinese have a phrase, and it's called 内外有别. And I remembered when I learned this phrase back in the 90s when I was studying with a Chinese tutor. And I asked her to explain it in a little bit more detail to me. And I said, what does it mean that insiders and outsiders are different? And she gave me this example. She said, when you and I go to the park, we buy tickets. My ticket costs $1 and your ticket costs $10. That's 内外有别. And I remember the light bulbs going off in my head because until that point, the only way for me to process that was that I was being cheated. She paid $1, I paid $10. Obviously, I was being cheated. And I told her that, and she said, but the Chinese look at it this way. Why should you, an outsider, pay the same price as me, an insider? And my only response was, because that's the way I've always been taught. And her response was, but that's not the way it is in China. And it was very freeing for me, because then I didn't simply just look at all of those types of situations as me being cheated. It was that I was an outsider. And according to the Chinese cultural rules, I really didn't have any right to have the expectation of being treated the same way. I think another important thing to remember about insiders and outsiders being different is that Chinese culture is an insider and outsider culture, which means that there are two kinds of people in the world. There are Chinese people and there are foreigners. It's kind of like Jew and Gentile. They're mutually exclusive categories. If you're a Chinese, you cannot be a foreigner. If you're a foreigner, you cannot be a Chinese. And particularly in the United States, this is very different, because foreigner is a relative concept. A foreigner is somebody who's not from here. But then a foreigner can become an American. I can't become a Chinese. I can live there all of my life. I can never speak English again. I can get a Chinese passport, but I will never be considered a Chinese person. And so really coming to terms with what it means to be an outsider in China is something very important, and it's also very difficult. Now, many people who go work in China, many people who want to serve in China are ethnically Chinese. So what if you're a Chinese American or you're a Chinese Canadian? How are you viewed when you go to China? And I will say that most Chinese people that you meet are, quite frankly, going to be a little bit confused, because they look at you and you're obviously Chinese, because it's an ethnicity. Yet culturally, you're American, culturally, you're Canadian. You might not even speak a word of Chinese, and that is very hard for them to process. So your cross-cultural adjustment, your cross-cultural clashes may be a little bit different than the Caucasians that you're working with, or Caucasians who go and work in China, who are very clearly, in the minds of Chinese, outsiders. You are kind of, am I in or am I out? I'm not really sure on that. Another thing we see in Chinese society in this area is that the Chinese not only delineate between Chinese who are insiders and foreigners who are outsiders, there are different levels of insiders within Chinese culture too. A person from Beijing will refer to a person from Henan province who lives in Beijing as a Waidi Ren, not a Waiguo Ren, not somebody from another country, but somebody from another place. And so there are insiders and outsiders based on your province or your city, or even down into the school system. You have your classmates are your insiders, and people from another class are the outsiders. So these are the points at which you are likely to experience the most severe culture clashes. And I think if we can get a handle on them and begin to understand them, I don't think we can understand them fully as foreigners, it will help in our cross-cultural adjustment.